Now, China is showing some new approaches, not only in economy or governance, but I also think in the world of diplomacy. It's become far more proactive on the international stage. It not only brought the Saudis and the Iranians to the negotiating table, but actually facilitated a fully fledged diplomatic reconciliation between these two former enemies, something that no one, seriously, no one thought was possible. What's China's secret here? Because I mean, everybody, all analysts I know, even here in Russia, were absolutely shocked by the news when they got it.
I think China, as we all know, that China is a promoter of peace and contributor to development. In the past 40 years, China is the only big country that has not launched or participated in a war. At the same time, China is also enjoying the dividends of the world peace. And China is different from the American. The United States is enjoying the dividends of war in the world. The more wars and the conflicts break out in the world, the more the American will benefit. For China, China prefer world peace. So I believe that the world has seen China's peaceful image. Saudi Arabia and Iran, you mentioned, also believe in China's peaceful sincerity. China does not promote the so-called offshore balance strategy. None will it bomb the Nord Stream pipeline. None will it engage in strategy to overthrow other countries' region. On the contrary, China hopes to promote regional reconciliation and economic reconstruction. This is why China is working hard to promote the reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran and the reconstruction of Afghanistan. So in fact, we also hope that Russia and Ukraine will reconcile.
These negotiations between the Iranians and the Saudis facilitated by China were kept in secret. No leaks, no speculations, which is very unusual in this day and age of the so-called megaphone diplomacy, when sensitive details are leaked to media for immediate impact, which I'm sure you would agree with me makes diplomacy not only ineffective, but pretty much impossible. I wonder if this discretion is specifically a Chinese feature, and given the sort of the demonstrated success of such approach, do you think it can come back into fashion in the world of diplomacy again?
Actually, I think many times we need a transparent national governance as well as diplomacy. The public has the responsibility and has a right to learn more about the governance. But on the other hand, diplomatic transparency is not 100% desirable, especially in the face of major complex foreign policy decisions. So I think it is necessary for the country to keep a certain count of secrecy so as not to be influenced by the unnecessary non-professional public opinion. So I'm not sure whether the so-called closed-door diplomacy has become a popular method or fashion. It depends on actual effect. I think a closed-door approach to a better cause is a responsible approach to great power diplomacy.
Now, the most fascinating aspect of this whole development, for me at least, is the position of Saudi Arabia, which nominally is still an American ally, and yet it's far more engaged both economically and politically with China, and to some extent even Russia than Washington. What do you think it made it possible for Riyadh to pursue their own path with little, if any, consideration for whatever Washington has to say?
If I were a Saudi, I would feel that Saudi Arabia has been deceived by the US for so many years. Saudi Arabia should enjoy the peaceful environment in Middle East and continue to develop. But the US has used the offshore balancing method for more than half a century to create chaos and disorder in Middle East, which in turn make Middle Eastern country depend on United States. So this is an important tradition of Western realism diplomacy. So now Saudi Arabia is waking up. So this is good things. In my opinion, the US should respect those regional countries and not just treat them as tools or even just a beautiful such a napkin. Put it away when it's not in use and use it to wipe your mouth when it is useful.
Well, it's a very conspicuous metaphor, and I think it's not yet inspiring for our neighbors in Ukraine, who remain in a very close relationship with the United States, to the extent that their own country has been sacrificed for the sake of fighting Russia. Now, as I'm sure you know, many people in Russia were inspired by China appointing its own envoy for the conflict in Ukraine, perhaps trying to build on its own diplomatic success on the Middle Eastern front. But I wonder how this appointment was received in Kiev. Does China have enough weight, enough influence, enough credibility with the current Ukrainian authority to produce any change on that front?
I think that to my honesty, how say the Russia is our very real friend, but also Ukraine is China's strategic partner too. In very long terms, we have a very good relationship and cooperation with Russia as well as with Ukraine. So that's why I think that China try our best to persuade the reconciliation between Russia and Ukraine. For Ukraine, I think China will not harm Ukraine, and let alone deceive or encourage Ukraine to check and balance Russia and then be beaten. So China wants Ukraine economy to recover, and China is also willing to invest in Ukraine and participate in the reconstruction of Ukraine infrastructure. So I really hope that Ukraine and Russia can restore peace and reduce deaths. So I think we, most of the Chinese people, we press Ukraine, but also press Russia.
Now, last year, you described Ukraine as having the body of a strong man and the fate of a servant girl. And I think perhaps that was too optimistic, because Ukraine at this point of time is in a far grimmer situation. The country is half destroyed, a quarter of the population left the country, the infrastructure is ruined. And the big question is who is going to rebuild Ukraine or help it rebuild, because obviously it does not have enough resources. Do you think this is something that China could use as, let's say, not as a temptation, but as something that could really attract the Ukrainian leadership? Because the Americans and the Europeans may talk about their support for Ukraine, but it's still pretty unclear whether they want to fund the rebuilding of that country. What's your view on that front?
Yeah, I always think that the current situation in Ukraine is a historical tragedy. Ukraine is one of the countries with the largest land area in Europe, and Ukraine's population ranks among the top 5 in Europe. And Ukraine should have been a big country in Europe, but it's a very pity for Ukraine that Ukraine's strategy in the past 30 years has not shaped the independent standard of regional power. On the contrary, Ukraine has always been willing to be a vessel of Europe and the United States. In the past 30 years, Ukraine has turned to the West most of the time, but it has not brought Ukraine economic growth and national strength. On the contrary, Ukraine has become the poorest country in Europe. So that's why I sincerely hope that Ukraine can reflect on itself, grow up from the lesson of history, and become a bridge between Eastern and Western civilization, instead of being attached to a certain military group and becoming a tool for balancing other aspects.
Dr. Wang, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for watching. Hope to see you again on Worlds Apart.